Texas, home of smarter news, finds itself in the middle of one of the top news stories of the week. I have some new reporting for you on that, plus a little perspective about journalism in crisis that I'm curious your thoughts on. So let's set the stage. It's been bitterly cold in Texas for about a week now, with lots of ice, some snow, and freezing temperatures with absolutely no break. And if you live somewhere cold, you might think, what's the big deal? But I can tell you, as a relatively new Texan, I've only been here for a couple of years now, one thing that becomes abundantly clear is that your entire life in Texas is geared towards staying cool because it's just so hot for so long. So when I woke up and it was 3 degrees outside, our home is simply not built for that, like so many other Texans. And that's why you're hearing reports of people losing water or losing heat or Wi-Fi or cell service or not being able to use the roads because there's no salt or no snow plows or losing power. That is the big issue of the day. So what do you need to know about power in Texas? Texas has its own power grid. Most of Texas, about 90% of Texas has its own power grid. The rest of the lower 48 states are actually tapped into 2 different networks. Why is that? Why does Texas have its own power grid? There's a few different reasons for that, a few different angles of the story. Way back when, Texas did not want to fall under the umbrella of federal regulation. Also, Texas has a lot of energy resources, and you may think in your mind oil wells for Texas, but the fastest growing energy in the state of Texas is actually wind power. So you have a desire not to fall within federal regulations. You have a lot of resources at your fingertips, and you also have a feeling in Texas of self-reliance. All of that combined, and you got your own grid. On the one hand, you can describe Texas as self-sufficient and independent. On the other hand, you can also describe Texas as isolated. In fact, one person described Texas as an electrical island. So no one can turn on the spigot and overnight us some extra power. And although Texas has a lot of resources, the weather has disrupted both fossil fuel and green energy sources alike. And there's simply just not enough power, as more than 4 million Texans have experienced. And there's a big question about when it will return. So isolation doesn't sound ideal, right? But let's add a little bit of context. As we mentioned, most of the country is linked to 2 power grids. The largest electrical outage in United States history happened in 2003, and it all started with a down power line in Ohio. The ripple effects of that led to 50 million Americans being without power. So there's a risk as well for being part of a larger grid. So this is a dynamic story, but it's not just about the grid. It's also about this terrible weather we're experiencing. But I can't actually give you context for the historical nature of this freeze because we're still in it. We're still in a developing story, which leads me to my next point. When I'm watching the national news coverage of this story that I'm very much living, the trouble with journalism today is very much in Technicolor because the priority of the coverage is already on debate. Right versus left policies, fossil fuel versus green energy. Listen, commentary and debate matter. We should be asking very tough questions. But here's some perspective about where we're at in this story. I received an emergency recording from my county, and it said this: if you go out in this weather and you are stranded, we are not coming for you. So, with all due respect, we still do not know the extent of the damage done or the number of people who have died. Which leads me to a pattern in news delivery that I'm actually trying to solve. Whether it's historic weather or a terrorist attack or a school shooting, think about how quickly the coverage turns to the debate. How much more time is spent on the debate rather than what actually happened. We want strong debate. It's really important. But how can you have strong debate if you don't know what the facts are? And there's actually a much bigger story here. Yes, this is about Texas, and it's about the power grid, and it's about historic weather, and it could be about state versus federal rights, and left versus right, or north versus south, or green energy versus fossil fuel, or however you want to slice it. But here's a headline from just a few weeks ago. Russians who pose election threat have hacked nuclear plants and power grid. Now, there's nothing to suggest what we're seeing in Texas has anything to do with foreign interference, but that's a big headline. I missed it too. Think about how much you heard about election interference and how little you heard about this story that actually impacts every single one of us. One of the big lessons I've learned as a journalist is that you can competently cover a story and still completely miss the point. And I almost did that today. But a few hours of watching our electricity flicker and filling empty jugs with water snapped me out of it, gave me the reality check that I needed to focus again on what really matters. Why does this story in Texas matter? You have millions of people in the most powerful nation in the world without basic resources like running water and electricity, and no idea when it will return, plus another several days of freezing temperatures. And let's take it one step further. How safe and reliable are America's power grids overall to threats like bad weather or those who would like to do us harm? What questions should we really be asking? And how should we prepare to keep our families safe, just in case? We luckily have power right now, but we have some friends staying with us with small children who have no water. So it's been stressful. And we had a whole week planned for Smarter News to celebrate 3 years of the company, and that's been disrupted. But in some ways, this has really brought me back to the founding principles of Smarter News: quality over quantity, curiosity over commentary, prioritizing why it matters rather than endless debate. I love the news. I love the news. The tough stories and the great stories. These are the stories of our lives, and these stories are not separated by grid. I put the resources for this story underneath the video on our website in case you would like to see some of the sources I used or read a little bit more. In the meantime, wherever you are, stay safe and always more on smarternews.com.